Two friends and I hiked Hawk Ridge Trail near Mount Shasta beginning on the 14th of April. We all have years of experience camping in this terrain and have been doing trips much like this for the past several years. Never during any of these trips outdoors, years camping and hiking in this beautiful state, have we encountered anything quite like the hiker from last weekend. We were sitting around the campfire in our camp. It was the night of the 18th, so we'd been hiking in the area for a few days. Despite the good weather, we hardly encountered anybody on the trail and found ourselves alone in the dusty campground. I finished my beer and gazed into the darkness beyond our tents. The forest was silent, and we all sat quietly enjoying our time in the secluded spot. The silence is broken by a branch suddenly cracked in the forest. We could hear the familiar sound of footsteps, breaking pine needles and small twigs with every single step. I looked to my friends, who also seemed to share the same feeling of interest and concern. After all, it was late in the night, and whatever it was didn't have a light, so we figured it couldn't be a person. We waited listening for several tense moments. The footsteps grew closer, and a figure edged out of the trees in the darkness. I got my flashlight and shined it on the mass. The sight nearly had me drop the torch in my hand. Wearing strange patches of cloth, sewn into a ragged, dull jacket and pants. He wore no backpack, no headlamp, or even shoes. I watched with a dry mouth as a man stepped with awkward strides towards our campsite. His matted long gray hair covered nearly every inch of his face. He made a strange expression that looked like almost angry wincing as he walked closer. The closest friend to me grabbed his knife while I reached for the pepper spray that was nearby. The guy was getting close now. The man finally stops about 10 yards from the fire pit we were sitting at moments ago. I asked him to back up and tell us what the hell he was doing out so late without a light. My torch is still directly on his face as he walked up and stood there. I didn't care for formalities at that point. I was too freaked out. I try to find what he's looking at, but can't seem to figure it out. He simply continues to stand and stare into the forest, simply through us, almost as if we weren't there to even bother him. When the deranged old-timer started screaming at the top of his lungs, I had to cover my ears. It was so damn jarring. It sounded like an animal that was fatally wounded, screaming at the top of its lungs, trying to grasp at life. It was perhaps the most disturbing thing I'd ever heard coming out of a human being. I then decided to do something arguably irrational, and I pepper sprayed the man. The sounds coming out of his mouth were so disturbing and so incoherent, I decided he must be either hammered or deranged. Whatever it was, he scared me enough with his violent yells that I figured pepper spraying him might be the best bet. So I did just that. After a nice dose to the eyes, the man stopped yelling and started violently coughing. He sort of stood in place for a few moments. My buddies and I, ready for his next move, stood there watching. The man continued coughing in deep, violent hurls. His eyes stayed open the whole time. I watched the unchanging pair of glassy blue eyes stare straight forward. It dawned on me then. The guy was blind. He was blind, walking around the forest in the middle of the night. My friends and I yelled across the fire about what to do next. None of us were quite sure about the right action, as the man was just about the strangest thing we'd ever seen. The man suddenly begins to turn and walk out of our camp back toward the forest in the darkness. We watch him slowly walk through the brush, occasionally stumbling but always maintaining a steady and disturbing cough. I hardly slept that night. I swear I could hear him retching and stumbling through the forest until the early morning. That scream, that terrible scream, still ran through my mind whenever I closed my eyes. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you'll consider sticking around to hear more interesting and, well, creepy content.